Morning, lovelies. We've been looking so far at unseen and anthology poetry for GCSE and working up to how we would write those in a full essay. So far we've looked at form, we've looked at two different types of form, the sonnet and the dramatic monologue. We've looked at how you write about form, how you prioritise things, how you pick out the big ideas, and we've looked at things that you could say for a particular poem in the anthology as well as the unseen. So we're going to do the same kind of thing with structure, and it'll go a little faster this time because we know the structures that we're working to. So what we're going to have a look at in this session is what structure is, what to look out for, and also how to put that together into an essay. So we're going to have a look today at and it says what is form, where it should say what is structure. So structure is anything that changes in a poem. Poems quite often, they will have a sense of movement in the poem. There'll be something, it starts in one mood or feeling or idea, and then it develops or it changes and extends to another. So I'm looking very much about the movement and the change in a poem across from the beginning to the middle to the end. Title could be considered an aspect of structure. Order, and I'm thinking about why this and then this. That's really important. Why did they start with this idea and finish with this idea? Why did they start with this feeling and then finish with this feeling? Why start at this point in whatever it is? Because there's always things that come before. And again, why finish here? Why not go on for another verse? Why not extend and go on into, sometime into the future there? I'm looking at the mood, and to be honest, with structure, you could do worse than concentrate only on the mood and talk about what the mood is like at the beginning and what the mood is like at the end, looking for any turning points or pivots, any shifts, any developments. I'm going to give you some words that will help you do that as well. I'm looking for what's the internal thoughts of the poet, what's the poet's voice, what's their perspective, their view on things, and then what happens, because those two things may be distinct and different. Then there are three things that are almost not structure. I'm just going to lump them in with structure because they don't have anywhere else nice to sit. And remember anyway, there's no real divide between form, structure and language. And these are usually covered with the umbrella term of writers' methods. So they're all part of methods. But I'm thinking as well, when I look at a poem, a structure is a nice place to look at it. What's the voice? Is it first person narrative, an I or a we? Is it second? Is it talking to a you? Or is it third, using he or she and writing with a persona almost, or maybe perhaps writing about themselves but not using I? I'm thinking also, who's the audience for this? And was it supposed to be private, or was it supposed to be public? Or was it depending to be one thing and then another? For instance, I'm thinking of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems, which are very private, but then were written to be published. And they were written almost with a little bit of subterfuge there, that it was pretended that they were secret poems that were private between two people and then published, but they were actually, tender moments perhaps between her and her husband. And I'm also thinking about the tense, whether it's present tense or past tense or so on. You'll see these things at work in the poem that I'm going to look at today, which is one we've seen before. These adverbials and phrases are things that will help you, and you can see also verbs as well in there, that will help you write naturally about structure. And they help signpost to the examiner, to the person who's marking, to the teacher, that that's what you're doing. So you can see this list here, and I'm going to put the list up on the website so that you'll link to that and you'll find those easily, can study them rather than having to pause here. But you don't have to use anything complicated. You might start with initially, first of all. The writer creates or establishes a mood of blah blah blah. Then you don't have to do anything fancy. I don't need to say then as things unfold or subsequently. Then will suffice. But I could use the verbs there to talk about how the writer intensifies a mood or elaborates on an idea or deepens a feeling or shifts or changes. I can also there, when I'm talking about progression and movement, I can talk about whether that's a gradual thing and use adverbs like gradually, or I can talk about whether that's sudden with suddenly. I can refer backwards and forwards, and I find myself quite often using earlier or later. That helps me describe why the writer add something in a particular point. So I say, so it helps us understand why later this is going to happen, or helps us understand why earlier the writer said this, and links the whole thing together. And then we've got some adverbials there for the ending, things like, finally we'll do, at the end, and the idea of resolution or building up to or finishing with, those are perfectly satisfactory as verbs that you can use to talk about structure. So I find myself using those words all the time when I'm talking about structure, and they're all really, really useful to help me do so. So we're looking again at In a Station and a Metro, which we'd already looked at in terms of form, and I like it just because it's confounding. So we've got Ezra Pound, who in that very, very teasing way said a rose is a rose is a rose, and dared us to think of things as metaphorically or symbolically relevant. So he presents us with two ideas: the apparition of these faces in the crowd, and then gives us almost like what I consider to be a bit of a challenge: petals on a wet black bough. Like, I dare you not to think of these two things as connected, especially since I've used a semicolon to say that they are. So I like it because it's intriguing and it's simple, and it's also ridiculous. You're never going to get a poem that's this baffling for an exam. So we need also to think about how things change, how things develop, and so you can see here the things that I might start to talk about. So we have got a title, In a Station of the Metro, which helps situate the poem and tells us where it is. We have got a beginning, we've got the faces at the beginning, and the notion of the crowd, and then we've got an end. I don't think we've got a middle very much, but we have got a semicolon in the middle there, and we finish with the idea of the petals on a wet black bough. For me, I think there's something almost, I don't know, it's that word apparition. It's the way they appear. It's not these faces in the crowd, it's the apparition. There's something almost, I don't know, quite mystical about that word, quite ghostly, quite ephemeral, quite, I don't know, transient, fleeting. I don't know what these words are. They can't quite grasp, something momentary about it, perhaps. So that's how it starts for me. And then it finishes with wet black bough. They're quite serious and solemn words in lots of ways. I don't know about bow, but the sounds of it, everything, the way they are together, creates a kind of mood at the end of something more serious. These are just my impressions. I mean, it's like looking at it's abstract art. You can't really say for sure that one thing is one or another, but it seems to have that kind of something, a sense of transience and motion and movement that becomes more serious and quite solemn by the end for me. When we're thinking about internal thoughts versus external actions, it's actually really hard, and this is really interesting because I'm thinking, are these his thoughts? The apparition of these faces, that suggests this is the way that he's thinking about them. And then the petals and the wet black bough, they're two just external things, just things that happen in life, that random things that he sees. Is there a sense of thought, or is it just external actions? And it's really hard to tell because he doesn't do any of the things that we consider to give us a voice. So there's no I, there's no sense of tense. We're going to talk about these things in a minute, but I don't know who this is for. I don't know who wrote it. There's quite a lot of mystery about it, and sense something almost momentary, I think. So when I was thinking about it, and our aim is to think about all of the features of structure that we could look at and to come up with a big list, if you like, of all the things before thinking about what the big idea is and what aspect of structure best supports that. I think for me it's very much a single moment, and there is the idea that something he sees gives way to another thought. So he sees the faces in the crowd and it gives way to the thought that the petals on a wet black bough. And that's what I mean by he's teasing us with, like, dare you to consider these two things as a metaphor. The title gives us kind of a situation in a station of the metro, and without that, I don't know, it could be absolutely anywhere. So it fixes it a little bit, I think, the title. There's a sense of something timeless. I mean, obviously, since the development of metros. But, we still have metros today. So, I mean, it could still be now. There's a sense of almost timelessness. There's no sense that this is over 100 years old, this poem. There is a sense of also what metro? You know, metros are, I guess Paris, partly because I know that's where Ezra Pound was living, but Tokyo also has a metro, New York metro. So there is a timelessness and a placelessness about it, and a voicelessness, because I still don't know who's speaking. Is it a persona? Is it him? Is it his thoughts? Is it just what he sees? There is, as I explained with the last bit, and I'd have to explain, I think, in a little bit more detail, that shift between something quite beautiful, the petals, to something quite sombre, the wet black bough. And especially when you start thinking about the symbolism of that, what petals mean in Japanese culture, for instance, and you can start to see, which I think this poem is very much influenced by Japanese culture. I'm not just randomly picking that out of thin air, but there's such a lot going on there. And it was still in the back of my mind, got Ezra Pound going, dare you, come on, not to think of this as a symbol, just to think of these as two, you know, perhaps unconnected, unrelated ideas. But he does this thing, and I'm going to have to shift over the edge a little bit there, because we've got the semicolon that just appears at the end of that second line. And that's the volta, that's the turning point. So for us as readers, we really do have a sense that there is a turning point there. And I did think there must be a reason. Why have the petals after the faces? You know, that's significant. There's a reason he didn't start with petals on a wet black bough, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. There's a reason why he put one first and then the other, and that's why I said before, I think it gives way to the faces remind him of, or make him think of, or lead to a thought of petals on a wet black bough. So then we have our process when we're thinking about, okay, how do we talk about structure? So we've identified all of the aspects we could talk about. So that was me working through what's at the beginning, what's at the end. It's very easy to do when there's like a title and 2 lines. But you could see, even with only a title and 2 lines, there were plenty of things I could write a paragraph about. Then I need to think about the big ideas and what the poem is about, and kind of connect that then, the mood and any shifts, in order to be able to think about, okay, what was he doing in terms of structure that best supports that? And then we have a go at writing our paragraph. Now, remember in the exam, whether we're doing an unseen poem or a poem we prepared like an anthology poem, we've still, especially in a comparative essay, we've only got a very short time to write. So we're looking at something that would take us maybe 3 or 4 minutes to write. So this is the example that I'd put together. And you can see some of the language that I've started to use that's helping me write about structure too. So the poem starts with the image of faces, which the title suggests that he sees or remembers in a station of the metro, because it could be a remembered event as well, especially with apparition. Then it concludes immediately with the image of petals, or the wet black bough at least. It's as if the faces prompt him to think about the petals. Do you know what I mean about the giving way to? Like they remind him of them. While they could be separate ideas and thoughts, the semicolon works a link between them, saying that they are connected and the petals are in some way linked to the faces. It's about the colour and the shape of the faces that make him think of petals. They're also very natural things, has a poetic significance in that blossom are a reminder of the cycle of life and that beauty is not eternal. It begins with the statement about the faces and finishes with an image that is profound and sombre, as the petals are a symbol of fragile beauty and the way beauty fades. It finishes with a serious tone. At the beginning it was observational, scientific and objective, whereas at the end it's sad and serious and we're reminded that beauty is fragile. And all of that just from 2 lines. Now, as I said, Ezra Pound really wasn't very interested in metaphors and symbolism. He wanted to steer us away from that. So that's why it kind of always seems as an interesting bit of a challenge that we get those 2 ideas. But I would argue very strongly, based on the way he puts those things together, and particularly that semicolon, he really wants us to consider those 2 things as being linked, and that the one thing then gives way to the other, and it's the structure of that that helps us. So in the next essay, in the next video, we're going to be looking at how we can start to do this with some poems that you've studied and some poems that you've looked at, and how we can also structure our paragraphs there too.